There we go. Okay, so there were a few videos where by rose-colored glasses, I believe was their name. I can't remember. Something like that. And they had a few critical things to say about you, Hunter. There was one comment that was probably at least several pages long, detailing like a lot of this stuff. Honestly, I didn't read the whole thing. Maybe I kind of skimmed through it if I remember correctly. And they also seem to pick favorites every other video. This is over the course of 4 or 5 videos. I remember Joey was one that they triumphed, and then I think another week it was Eric was picked as somebody who was like the antagonist of Hunter, who was, you know, all absolute unreason. And then you have the wonderful angelic influences of Eric and Joey that occasionally can disrupt Hunter. So that seemed to be the main dynamic that our fans are picking up on. So I'm fine with giving them a little drama, you know, all 2 or 3 of them.
Right, this is all prologue here for the semester that's about to unfold.
Exactly.
I'm about to tear you open on Bataille, and I hate all of you.
Yeah, this is setting up all the everybody, you know, anybody that's new to the seminar. It might be you. You could be the heel of you know, the whole audience. As soon as you walk up, as soon as you're like, hey, I got something to say about Bataille, everybody boo. And then Eric comes in and everybody, yeah, woo. Yeah,
this isn't Sophocles or some random guy is trying to defend Creon, you know.
Yeah,
That scenario.
Yeah.
Well, this is a good time to start talking about the accursed share. So we read the preface in part 1, the theoretical intro. One thing that I'll say, just to get the ball rolling, is that his introduction was charming, right? Because he's trying to justify how it came about. He's writing this. He's been known to write literature, and yeah, he writes some interesting things, like this idea that he's working on isn't useful, I think he says.
I like the very first thing he says is that political economy from me is disconcerting. You don't really want to hear me talk about this. But I also, it's funny that the beginning is like self-deprecating self-awareness, and then it kind of feels almost pompous, like this is unreal, and you don't know what you're about to read.
And then, of course, he has the tiger line, right? I'm just going to read from the back of the book. If one has the courage to read my book, one will find it in this affirmation that the sexual act is in time what the tiger is in space. So Cole and I talked about that a little bit. Big fans, Bataille, wow.
I'm not sure exactly what he means by that line. It seems very interesting. I'm not exactly sure where his distinction with space and time is operating, though. Well, I mean, we just started this work, but kind of in general, what are his, you know, metaphysics of space and time? I'm not really sure. I did get a lot of Bergsonian vibes from the first chapter, especially, what was it, pages 22 to 23, where he's talking about this idea of the organism, and the restricted point of view is seeing something that is from the perspective of the particular limited organism. And that's why it perceives these things as kind of abstract, you know, fragments, and then post these things together. It comes up with some kind of general idea that is really based off of these particulars. And instead he's trying to get us to see this general point of view where you're looking at the movement of the whole circulation of energy on the surface of the earth. So it seemed definitely like there's you could maybe get some kind of a temporal element out of that, where you have this kind of primary process of circulation, this movement of energy, and then you get these sort of, I guess, abstractions out of that, where you have people that are, that's the rational economy kind of thing, where they're always looking at a particular segment of something from a particular point of view, that always sees in terms of, you know, these ends, and kind of spatializes time in that sense. So I definitely, yeah, I don't know if that's just me reading it in such a Bergsonian way, just because I'm degenerate or something like that, but yeah, it definitely seemed interesting. So
I think the tiger quote in particular, I feel like it's less relevant to wonder as to what his metaphysics of space and time is. I think more clearly it's that, like, a tiger being a predatorial animal is absorbing energy. It's being like a focus point of that energy where it's going. And then the sexual act in a lifetime is considered the same thing, where it's absorbing that energy and expending it, like a regulator of excess, like population control in the example of the tiger.
Maybe I have too reductionist to reading, but it seemed to me, again, well, maybe this is too superficial, but that it looked like to me he was just talking about energy in a fairly sort of commonplace sense of physics, in that you've got, you know, that the universe as a whole is really a whole, and that every part of the system affects every other part of the system. And so that anything that happens within the entire universe involves a movement of energy, like any event at all involves a movement of energy. But then what we do is we carve up the whole into these isolated chunks, and we say, well, here's this system and here's this system. So we do the standard analytical thing, which is to break things into parts and then ask how those parts then relate to one another. But that's an artificial way of looking at a real system, because when you break it apart into chunks and then say, now what are the relations between these chunks, you lose the really what's the word I'm looking for? Exhaustive interconnections between everything, so that there's these exhaustive permeations of energy flows from every part to every part. And when you slice them up, you can't put them back together in a way that actually shows you what's going on, because what's going on is this constant sliding and movement of energy flows in the system. And that when you try to break it up and analyze things in those chunks, you lose essential information, and that the loss of that information produces tragic outcomes. And so that was the general sense I had. Again, maybe I'm reading it too reductionist away. I mean, what if I'm at all right? One of the questions I have is, I don't understand. So part of this excess thing, I'm wondering if part of the excess is that you have excess energy that then moves elsewhere. So you have different systems producing excesses. So you've got all of these sources and sinks where energy is moving all these different places in different ways. That if it wasn't that case, then the system would just be static. So, if you can imagine a system where everything is generating and consuming energy within this system and within this system and within this system and within that system. And you would have these isolated systems that maybe were you could analyze fairly effectively independently, but in reality, I mean, what that would do is that would give you a model of the whole system that was essentially static, because you would just have these chunks that were doing their own little thing, and the system of a whole would have there would be no movement in the system as a whole. You know, that would just be these sort of static relations between these independent chunks. And you know, what I was thinking he was suggesting is it's not like that at all. The whole system is constantly is like one big giant energy movement. And so, you know, if you don't have, it's kind of like in a weather system, you've got to have low pressure and high pressure systems in order for there to be weather, right? You've got to have low pressure and high pressure systems in order for masses of air to move from one place to another. And I'm wondering if, you know, we know that the whole universe is in this state of dynamic movement, or the biosphere, or whatever part. And in order for that to account for that movement, you've got to take into account the way that these systems generate excess energy, which then flows into other places. And, you know, how that ends up, you know, producing the kind of negative, or of how ignoring that produces the kind of negative results that he cites, I really don't know, which may mean I'm completely off base there.
Would it be fair to ask that we go either page by page or paragraph by paragraph? Because I feel like our beginning statements are just kind of like too broad, and I feel like it helps first to just make sure everyone's on the same page with understanding of each section that comprises it.
I have an idea. To meet in the middle between our chaotic, freewheeling desire for anarchy and something like stability and, you know, form to our discussion. I agree with you, Cole, that I want to do two things. I want to talk about two. First, I actually should write them down because I am so scatterbrained. But I want to point to two things. I just want to do two things. And the way I'm going to do it is through reference to a particular section. There are two basic, at the very end, actually, yes. At the very end of the reading, starting from 23 to 26, starting from 23 to 26, the section war considered as a catastrophic expenditure of excess energy. Here's what I meant when I said meeting in the middle. If we want, yes, we could start at the start, or we could, you know, jump to the specific points in the text that we feel are relevant to the specific things we're talking about. But
then won't we get into a problem where we start talking past each other? People they haven't comprehended parts of the text yet, so it's not really meaningful to discuss your individual takeaway from the entire reading. Like, I feel like it's helpful to go page by page.
Well, I mean, sure. If we want to operate on the miserly system of guaranteed homogeneity between our readings, then absolutely. I think we could definitely start from the beginning. We could cut because otherwise I was going to start responding to Eric about the notion of the dynamism of excess versus the dynamism of negativity. I was going to try and see how I could, you know, argue that Bataille isn't necessarily contra Hegel, but you're right. You know, I mean, to what degree, you know, do we even kind of know what we mean when we say like a dynamism of negativity and the dynamism of excess? If you'd like, then absolutely, we could just and how it gets to those catastrophic ends. I don't know. Yeah, if you feel like it would be more productive to kind of work our way there, if we can, within the sort of time frame that we have on this short life we live on Earth. Absolutely. That's totally sure. That's fine.
Yeah. I mean, I think the preface is also a little easier to get through because he talks a lot about his own like emotional response and things like that. I don't know if you guys take notes per page, probably.
I do. I write a summary of every paragraph, and then I make that a blurb, and then I copy those back down onto a notebook, and I organize those by category.
Okay,
notes.
I do that too. We could probably just go off those.
Sure, whatever. If you guys want to begin at the beginning, I don't care really. I'm not wedded to anything. I don't know. We usually, yeah.
One danger there is if we're going to discuss the extensive notes that everybody has on every paragraph, we'll be lucky if we get through the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. in the next
I'm not saying the extent of notes, just like you can summarize. I mean, the important elements of the page.
Well, without further ado, let's begin then. With the preface, the first paragraph, or like the first section, we'll say, he's talking about why he's writing this book, right? And so from what I understand of Bataille and his history, he's written a lot of literature, okay? And I think that's what most people know about this, right? Is that he's written literature, and he has this strange idea that isn't popular, number one, in economics. Because can we agree that this book is about economics? Like the first chapter is called The Meaning of General Economy.
I mean, I think the danger with that assumption is that, when I hear economics, I think of economics in really narrow terms, like economists and so, whereas his notion of a general economy is, I think he makes this point, is much more general than that. It's a general economy. But I think if if I think of this as an economic theory, then I tend to think of it in terms of things like international economics and macroeconomics and microeconomics. And I think he's trying to push the notion of economics way past those boundaries.
Yeah, I think it's like he says on the second page, that he's that what he's exploring may hold the key to all the problems posed by every discipline concerned with the movement of energy on Earth, from geophysics to political economy, by way of sociology, history, and biology. Moreover, neither psychology nor in general philosophy can be considered free of this primary question of economy. And it's like he says later on, he considers a cold and calculated economic, purely from the economist's standpoint, they're viewing, they're not viewing the systems outside of it, which he's imposing on it based on those disciplines.
Yeah, it seems like the thing he's mainly trying to convey is that this is, quote unquote, a book of political economy, but it is also much more. It's political economy that connects with all these other subjects in a very intimate way. So in a way, he's kind of trying to say, okay, yeah, I can't really define exactly according to any of these pre-established genres or, disciplines of whatever academic study. So I'm going to write here, this is a book of political economy, but here's a preface here telling you that it's also much more than that. And so you've got to understand that it's much more complex than some normal book of political economy where they're going to be using these terms of, normal economics. Yeah, the whole macroeconomic kind of thing. So yeah, that's what it seems to me like he's saying here, but that also kind of goes along with it. The big thing he's talking about is that, okay, this idea of general economy, which is, what does that mean in terms of economy? Well, expenditure, consumption of wealth rather than production is the primary object. So that is what he's saying is this Copernican revolution in thinking about economics, and it's something that hasn't been really, I think he believes this is a pretty novel idea. I don't know if anybody else has come up with something like this exactly. So he's saying, yeah, this is why it doesn't have some kind of pre-established genre of talking about it, because this is a new concept that kind of goes in between. It's kind of a transversal between all these different disciplines. So yeah, that seems to be the real takeaway from at least the first 2 pages or so.
I was gonna ask, how do you feel about the style of writing? Do you think he's purposefully mystifying himself in the preface, or do you think it's just it's just a rational way to explain that you're going to have problems with it because it's such a new or like a novel concept.
Probably
My
means I don't understand
impression-
it, but I thought the preface was pretty straightforward.
I can understand
I
that
was gonna
that's, oh, who was talking?
I was joking. I was gonna like, from my impression, I get his like this mystification quality is not that he's, you know, trying to prepare us for some new concept. He doesn't think we'll get it, it's too different. Or that he's being like deliberately mystifying, but that he's maybe tackling a topic that is itself like impossible to digest, impossible to put into words. And I think that's where he takes on that mystifying character. People accuse him of being a mystic because he does end up, despite its impossibility, like attempting to tackle it. And I think that's what he's getting at when he's being kind of like self-depreciative in the preface. It's like almost like he's saying like, yep, I'm doing this and it doesn't really make sense to be doing it. Which I feel like gets at that whole idea of waste. I was reading some secondary texts and they were talking like he wants to talk about waste, but his project of trying to add literature to this topic, trying to like, you know, give something to us, to our, you know, amassing of thought is kind of contra to this whole idea of waste.
Yeah, I especially like when he says that if he had followed the teachings of his own work, then he wouldn't have finished it at all, as part of why it's not like his aim to add wealth to humankind paradoxically spent his own energy in doing so. And sometimes he says he couldn't write because of that reason, but then he finished it anyway.
So I have a question about what exactly he's kind of what is the thing, this obstacle that is preventing him from articulating this? So it seems to be some kind of like a principle of reason or something like that. Is this similar to the same thing where, okay, so he's saying that, you know, this is an accumulation of knowledge and it kind of goes against the logic that is the object of the book, which is about, you know, expenditure and excess and something that can't be constrained in some kind of barrier or these limitations, including those that are, you know, conceptual and rational and whatnot. Is that kind of what he's talking about? And is there that connection between, you know, this kind of a rational economy and the more straightforward economic sense that I kind of get with where he's going in the later part of the book? And then also with this idea of, you know, just this accumulation of these different fields of knowledge where you have, you know, this particular perspective, you know, biology, you know, anthropology, these kind of things. Is he making that kind of connection there? And is that why he's saying this is a task that kind of works against itself in some way?
I keep hitting the same, you know, playing the same one string, but I mean, I took as part of the problem is just that, again, you have everything is, you know, this exhaustive interconnection, which makes analyzing almost impossible. And so, you know, the rational economies are based on analyzing independent pieces, figuring out how they work, and then figuring out how they interact. And you can do that, you know, like, and this is kind of like the thing, again, like with Bergson and, you know, these guys have been talking about where, or Nietzsche, even where, you know, you take a continuity, what's essentially continuity, and you carve it up in little chunks, because that makes it easy for the rational mind to grasp, because the rational mind wants to have independent objects that it can analyze and interrelate. And he's proposing this sort of vast field of interconnection. And how do you analyze that? I mean, I actually don't know how he's going to try to do it. He's going to give us lots of examples, I guess, but I took that to be the major problem. It's like trying to talk about an exhaustively interconnected fluidity with language and tools that are designed to talk about little objects and how they're related to one another.
Bataille writes something interesting on page 11, which I think is pertinent to what Nevitt and Chase were talking about, is the sort of contradiction of this book on expenditure, on waste, and trying to produce something to talk about it, right? So I'm just going to read it. This invites distrust at the outset. Well, let me read before for context. A book that no one awaits, that answers no formulated question, that the author would not have written if he had followed its lesson to the letter, such is finally the oddity that today I offer the reader. This invites distrust at the outset, and yet, what if it were better not to meet any expectation and to offer precisely that which repels, that which people deliberately avoid for lack of strength, that violent movement, sudden and shocking, which jostles the mind, taking away its tranquility, a kind of bold reversal that substitutes a dynamism in harmony with the world, for the stagnation of isolated ideas, of stubborn problems born of anxiety that refuse to see. And it goes on. Let's see. It would serve no purpose to neglect the rules of rigorous investigation, which proceeds slowly and methodologically. But how can we solve the enigma? How can we measure up to the universe if we content ourselves with the slumber of conventional knowledge? So what I got from that is, despite this seeming contradiction, this is something important that needs to be attempted. And if we are just satisfied with what we have so far and do not explore this new idea, it's all to our detriment. Maybe that's a basic reading of that, but there it is.
I like that point, Jackson. I put in the chat, like, philosopher of the impossible, right? It's like he's trying to almost like do that impossible task, and it's almost like his failure is maybe like an exemplification of what he's talking about. And then Nevitt, you mentioned examples too. I was reading somebody talking about Bataille, and they said, like, you know, his shortcoming is that he does end up trying to give examples. Which, you know, I just found funny. When you think you read like very abstract philosophers, maybe they just don't give examples at all. It kind of made sense of that idea of like, I can't give an example of this because it's always implicit.
Yeah, and he acknowledges that too when he says that for his purposes here, he's going to be using abstract concepts of like pure production or pure expenditure without going into the details, which he says he wants to get to in further volumes, but for the sake of showing you the whole picture, he can't.
Perhaps, oh, Chase.
Yeah, so one thing that I think is interesting about that is, okay, so the idea of these particular examples and this kind of impossibility of doing that. So all these, you know, he talked about, I think, pretty concrete historical kind of data to a certain extent, at least later in this book. It's like the Aztecs' practices of human sacrifice and whatnot. So I think there's the problem of, well, you can look at one particular thing, but then if you see it just from that perspective of that particular, you're committing the same kind of fallacy of, you know, isolation and restricted economy that he's highlighting as something of, no, this is what we're trying to think in distinction from that. So I wonder, I think he's aware of that largely, and then also that any of these examples are going to be, none of them are pure expenditure or anything like that. I think somewhere in here he talks about how, yeah, these are, you know, mixtures of both expenditure and also this kind of utility of production or whatever he wants to distinguish from that. So yeah, we can't really draw from any one example perfectly, which is another part of this, you know, kind of inner impossibility of this task that he's kind of talking about, but yet that's the only way to really go about it. So yeah, it's very much a kind of Bergsonian dialectic kind of thing between intellect and intuition. We're kind of jumping from this movement. What is he talking about? Yeah, a violent movement, sudden and shocking, which jostles the mind. Bold reversal that substitutes, okay, so he's talking about this other tendency. Bold reversal that substitutes a dynamism in harmony with the world for the stagnation of isolated ideas. Okay, so yeah, there's this, fixity of stagnation of isolated ideas versus dynamism in harmony with the world. He's got this kind of basic distinctions of movements, fixity versus circulation going on. And from there, he's kind of putting that also into a kind of, meta reflection on his own medium and how he's trying to articulate his own ideas in terms of also of this sort of economy of movement and fixity and whatnot. So yeah, interesting stuff.
I'm wondering, the end of the preface, this is something I was confused about a little bit. He says, to solve political problems becomes difficult for those who allow anxiety alone to pose them. It is necessary for anxiety to pose them, but their solution demands at a certain point the removal of this anxiety. The meaning of the political proposals to which this book leads and that I formulate at the end of this volume is linked to this lucid attitude. I'm wondering if anyone had any thoughts on the end of the preface, page 14, and what exactly he means that anxiety is necessary to pose the problems. And it seems that what he's doing is removing anxiety, right? He says it's necessary for us to get away from that. And what that is it terror? Because he mentions terror on the other page.
I took it as an organism's need to survive and quell its stressors. And he was saying, typically what you do is you take an anxiety and you immediately try to rectify that. And he's saying the only way to really see things as the whole, rather than trying to, in the case of an individual economic example of trying to convert wealth into productivity, in that case, you're not going to be able to see the entire process of what you're doing because you're just satisfying the immediate urges. I don't know if anyone else took that differently.
I kind of also got a little bit of the aspect there, and I underlined it in mine, where there's this attitude of freedom mentally, the freedom for which on page 13, for which instantly everything is resolved, everything is rich. In other words, everything that is commensurate with the universe. And to kind of lean a little bit on the last part about like the lucid attitude, less so that, at least from what I was interpreting it as, is less so of looking for the typical problem solution resolution, that there's a freedom at least in having lucidity of thought and a proper perspective of analyzing things as a whole, as an organic whole, rather than looking for, like, say, individualized axiomatic functions. So for me, lucidity of thought, at least from what I read, was more of having the proper perspective on things, not necessarily looking for an overarching solution.
For my part, I mean, I don't know what it's worth, but that last part that Jackson highlighted, solving political problems, it's necessary for anxiety to pose it. My mind immediately went to the struggle for to nuclear disarmament, right? There's a certain kind of anxiety that comes about before you pose it as a problem, right? Like, fuck, the United States has thousands of nuclear weapons. Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons. We have 9 nuclear weapon states. We can't guarantee that nobody's going to do something stupid, right? For perpetuity. We're living with these nuclear weapons. We got to do something about it, but most of us are powerless to do something about it, right? So we've got a nuclear Damocles over our head. that causes a kind of anxiety, right? However, there is actually a rational solution. There is a rational political solution. And anxiety plays a part in posing the problem and bringing people to the table. But anxiety has to be worked out of the solution, and in an effective solution will be eliminated, right? But just in envisioning the solution, you have to get past the powerlessness, right? So already you take a step away from the anxiety, or one major source of the anxiety, which is the powerlessness. If you remain with that powerless anxiety, then you also remain in a place where you can't do anything but suffer with that nuclear Damocles over your head.
And it's also kind of a self-destructive act to remove yourself from that immediate anxiety, which I think is part of why he thinks it's so difficult.
Yeah, it seems like you could also say paranoia is also a kind of thing like that too. Or it could just be another synonym for anxiety in that sense. But I think he's getting at something like that. And also, I think what Cole was saying about the organism, I think a lot of that anxiety he's talking about is from the perspective of us as particular individuals, because the consequences of understanding this movement is our own extinction, and that can be a anxiety producing thing. But in another sense, there's an act of identification and kind of go under the individual, which I think this is what he talks about as sovereignty, which I think we'll get to that. But the idea of basically not identifying with the particular individual so much, but more the kind of energy flow, the interconnected energy flow that is kind of underlying the particular individual. So I think the anxiety comes from that place of thinking that there is only, the atomized individual, the particular, and, it's all about survival at that point. In the same way that he's saying this restricted economy, it's all about, worry and restriction. Oh my God, do I have enough food? I need to stockpile. I need like a bomb shelter. I need, canned food in there for like at least a few decades. What if this happens? What if that happens? I need to get medical checks for everything. Like a hypochondriac paranoia is kind of the result of this kind of egoic atomism that he's saying it's the perspective we have on the economy too, in the sense of, oh, we have to accumulate more and more. What if we don't produce enough? We need more. I think he's getting at something, a kind of analogy between that and also where there's the kind of organism level, but also this kind of rational economy planning level that comes from that perspective too.
I generally agree with your point there, Chase. Unless anyone else has anything to say about anxiety, perhaps we can get into a theoretical introduction and just what general economy means. And I did have a question first, because the beginning of chapter 1, he talks about this traditional view of economics as production. And I've taken some economics courses in the past, and I know Bataille is going to really use this first definition and really look into it on the big scale. But can someone tell me or explain to me in detail or in some detail what this traditional view is, so it isn't just my presumptions on it, and what this idea of the general economy as production and accumulation is? I'm wondering.
Well, in Bataille's case, this would largely be the Marxist economic theory, in his case probably. And not super well read on that, but at the time, usually Marxists did consider production to be the main driving factor in economics rather than consumption. I think that's somewhat changed now, but like that would be part of it.
Yeah, I think he's definitely taking some from Marx, but also going against Marx's ideas of political economy at the same time. Where, yeah, definitely. So Marx is definitely going to say that production is the most important thing. You know, the means of production. That's where all the power is. And then capital has this kind of, you know, superficial gloss superstructure that kind of embeds itself over that, but then that ends up kind of taking over the means of production. So what I think he's, yeah, I think there's also the traditional view of a kind of, not sure what to call it, like liberal capitalism. I'm not sure what to even call it. There's some of these schools of economics. Okay, yeah, there's you know, there's like the classic libertarian liberal kind of von Mises kind of thing, and then there's Keynes, and I think he's reacting to some of those as well. And okay, so I can give like a probably really bad general description of kind of what I think is kind of this point of view that he's trying to, he's giving us the traditional point of view. Okay, I think if this is, okay, maybe this is, never mind, I'm not even going to say that. Okay, I was going to say, okay, fuck it, I'll say it. A lot of times when I'm reading these books, I envision them as characters, these different viewpoints, and usually people I know will take up certain positions. So one of these happens to be my dad often. I know what you're thinking. Yeah, I'm just going to assert that, which is probably evidence against it. But anyways.
I didn't say it.
I think I've basically said it for myself without actually saying it. So, okay. So the way I envisioned he would see economics is kind of like this, where basically, if you're a good person, you produce more than you expend. That's what a responsible, good individual does. You know, you come in this world, you've got this finite amount, set amount of accumulated materials, these resources. And then the whole idea is, yeah, you gotta have that Protestant work ethic, and you have to build on that. You have to accumulate and expand that. And if you die producing this increase in surplus, then good job, you're going to heaven or something. So in terms of economics, yeah, I want to read that, by the way. So I think he's thinking something like, I mean, that's how we think of the economy, if I'm not mistaken, that, you know, we need people out there working, producing things, accumulating. We need to take, you know, there's these resources out there, it's stuck in the ground, not doing anything. We need to go and take them out actively. We need, you know, massive central planning, and, you know, we need to lower corporate taxes so we have trickle down economics or something, and get all those resources out of the fucking ground and start, you know, producing them and turning them into productive machinery. And then we need to, you know, get stuff on the shelves, and then we need to have people buy that stuff. Oh, well, I mean, basically we just need to accumulate those things, you know, the buying, consuming, we'll worry about that later. But first and foremost, we need that production. So if we don't have that production, we're all going to starve. We're all going to die. And if at any time we stop for a few seconds, if we're not just highly attentive to it constantly, it'll just evaporate without our conscious attention. So we need to think that way. We need to plan the economy. We need to build it up, and that's what we do. So it's my Oedipalized idea of traditional economic point of view.
I really like that you think of characters to fit the roles of whatever philosophical perspective. I think that's neat. And I was talking to Hunter earlier, and something you said reminded me of our conversation. But if you follow the end of that idea of every resource that we have needs to be, gathered and used efficiently, Hunter brought up the idea of if we follow this to its end, we're going to have mining colonies on Venus and all of this network, every planet, create the technology and just start producing all of these things, just following the universe, which is infinitely expanding. And right behind it is us, just out there with our productive mindset, right? And that's logically absurd almost. And you can't really follow that because it would be so hard in the first place. And I think Bataille, now to shift from the traditional view to what Bataille's offering, says, okay, since this is not the case that we cannot be 100% efficient, what's causing us to not do that? This idea of expenditure. And I'm not sure if he used expenditure in this section or if I'm just borrowing from the paper we read a few weeks ago, but the idea of excess. And now the problem is not how do we become efficient 100% of the time, but how do we both view excess and what can we do about it?
It seems to me he's suggesting that excess is inevitable in these systems. And I wonder if he's trying to argue against the notion of scarcity. That there's these theories about that you will always consume more resources than are available. And then actually, Eric and I was in my class, we're reading Plato, and one of the things Plato says in the Republic is the cause of war is that human beings are always are never satisfied having merely their needs met. They want their desires in excess of their needs met. And once you start satisfying desires, they go on, they expand indefinitely. And so every community is going to be trying to satisfy these excessive desires that are ever expanding, and they will always run out of resources, which means they're always going to come into conflict, which means there will always be war. And you see, I can't remember the name of it, but this general notion of it, the almost evolutionary notion that systems always exceed the available resources. And it sounds like almost like Bataille is trying to say something against that and saying that these systems actually always generate excess. And the problem is less that we have restricted resources than we have excess energy that we tend to put in the wrong places. And so, so for example, the thing with war, you've got all these excess resources, and you've got to do something with them. I'm not sure you can't. I guess you just can't bank them all. So you've got to do something. And if so you could do that, like give everybody a whole bunch of money in your community. No, we're not going to do that. So let's go to war. So you've got. So it sounds like rather than saying we're always in this sort of like I said, restricted economy where we have restricted resources, we've actually always got an abundance. And the problem is not that we have restriction. The problem is we don't put the abundance in creative places. We put them in destructive places.
Right. If you tie this to anthropology, what year was this written?
19. I think he started in 1945 and published it in 1949.
Okay, so this would have been earlier than this, but it. Well, actually, he influenced some of this, but there was a theory that became more popular in the 60s, and it's still popular in a lot, which is called, I think, primitive affluence. And part of that was it was always running counter to the idea that human society is always built on scarcity, which was but it was actually, he influenced some of that theory, but part of it was also that basically that if you primitive, for a lack of a better word there, societies like this, they can produce more than they do. If you look like what they know how to do, plus their general social structure, but they don't, and that's because they're geared toward leisure and which would be waste, and certain waste rather than production. They try to do as little work as possible for the most leisure rather than as much work as possible to produce the most amount. And made that connection, I guess, to me. So I've been reading about that stuff.
I'm also interested in where he'll take it, because in something like Stir of the Eye or his erotic fiction, or I haven't read much of his actual theory and essays on his conception of the erotic, but from what I understand, limited experience is, for example, in the case of sexual experiences, the existence of a taboo to be transgressed against maximizes like this transcendent feeling of going against what actually may benefit you. And I feel like knowing, for having read that, Bataille's view might not even be that war's destruction is something negative. He might even view it as some sort of like sacred act where you transcend the everyday and how you're expending that energy.
Yeah, so one of the
I
things,
can't talk about Hegel. Hunter has to, so I'm just gonna wait for Hunter there. Sorry.
yeah, no Hegel. Yeah. Yeah, he seemed to, the tone was very serious when he was talking about war. I think if you consider the time, especially when he was writing it, that would make sense. I think to a certain degree, he's more kind of saying, yeah, it is inevitable that there needs to be some kind of expenditure of this excess energy, and if we don't do it in some kind of intelligent manner, I guess, then it's going to just kind of explode in a kind of catastrophic way that no one really wanted. And I think he's saying that a lot of war is like that, but also that it's kind of down to specifically World War I and World War II, that he was saying that that's because of this growth, this economic growth in the actual machinery of production and whatnot, which I think is pretty obvious. You know, machine guns, just basic machinery of production. Yeah, makes sense. So I think to a certain extent he's saying that that's a factor, definitely. Although there's definitely so one thing I've been looking at is these ideas of economies of violence, and especially in pre-state societies where they'll have violence as this kind of social force, but in a way that it isn't war, and they'll do it in a way that actually kind of keeps from some kind of central kind of social power figure from actually establishing itself as this kind of hierarchical leader. So this is actually familiar with Deleuze and Guattari. They get a lot of this stuff from these anthropologists studying this stuff. So I think there's something like that where he would say, yeah, there's always going to be this kind of violent, transgressive kind of activity involved with excess. It's always going to be something that, it's the accursed share. It's the thing that, is taboo, definitely. But then still, we can have, some ways are better than others. It's not the stupid relativist idea that whatever people have of it, whether it's like, oh, Derrida believes every interpretation of a text is just the same as every other one, or every truth is the same as every other one, every interpretation is the same as, yeah. No one believes that at all, nobody. And so he's definitely going to say, yeah, it is inevitable, but there's some kind of hierarchy of being able to establish a better and a worse form of expenditure than, and I think World War II, that's going to be on the end of probably a bad expenditure, or I think war in general, mechanized, organized state warfare, that's going to be on the bad side of the scale. So I think that's definitely a direction he's going, that, well, can we actually control this process or not? Is the whole idea of controlling it exactly what's the problem? We're trying to control these things, and they can't be controlled. I don't know. I kind of got the sense that there's some kind of like almost like a Nick Land kind of thing, where like technology is just like spiraling towards the singularity. Like this, it's a process that kind of exceeds everything. Are we just kind of just totally powerless in this, for something that'll exceed humans and take over, and the Ubermensch, and I don't know.
That's where I'm kind of curious to see where he goes with it, because on 22 he talks about the 22 to 23, he seems to be making a really strong focus on the overarching system of organic matter itself, the generalization, where he compares economy with a living matter, which I thought in and of it, to me, just as a side note, that was fascinating. I never really approached the aspect of the economy itself as living matter, so I thought that was wonderful, and I can't wait to read more. But the other thing was that on to 2023, about almost to the end, where he's building up to this aspect of there being a generalized function of living matter itself. And he says the general movement of exudation of waste of living matter impels him, and he cannot stop it. Moreover, being at the summit, his sovereignty in the living world identifies him with this movement. It destines him in a privileged way to the glorious operation, to useless consumption. And I don't know if anybody else kind of read that. The first thing that I kind of thought of was almost the Schopenhauer-esque definition of desire, or maybe even like the Lacanian objet, like the organism itself has a component of excess that has rooted desire into it that is never really going to truly be satiated. It's just leading to useless consumption. And I'm wondering if he's kind of approaching or laying the foundation of how we can handle that on a economic and philosophical principle like basis.
I'd like to read the very end of the paragraph that goes from page 24 onto page 25. So this is the end of the paragraph on page 25. He's just been talking about the First and Second World Wars. We can express the hope of avoiding a war that already threatens, but in order to do so, we must divert the surplus production either into the rational extension of a difficult industrial growth, or into unproductive work that will dissipate an energy that cannot be accumulated in any case. This raises numerous problems which are exhaustingly complex. One can be skeptical of arriving easily at the practical solutions they demand, but the interest they hold is unquestionable. And so he doesn't provide any concrete solutions there, but he does seem to say, again, that the production of excess energy is inevitable, but at least maybe we have some agency in how to direct that toward, what's the term? Anyway, basically wasting it away, kind of throwing it away rather than throwing it into something like war. So he says it's exhaustingly complex. I don't know ultimately, because like I said, it's the only thing I've read by Bataille. So I don't know how ultimately optimistic or pessimistic he is, but it seems like he suggests that at least there's the possibility of some agency in directing that excess to if not creative places, at least places where it can be wasted non-destructively.
Yeah. So yeah, and I wanted to touch on that point too, which I was seeing on page 21. And at the bottom of 21, he does say, like, it must be spent willingly or not, gloriously or catastrophically. But and then the two paragraphs in the middle of that page, particularly the one that starts with "of course," he does say, like, we can reconcile that kind of contradiction between means and ends, which I was reading as him almost saying, like, we have ends, but then our like ways of going about them is always going to produce that excess. And, you know, that excess is usually denied by us under this kind of like idea that everything's going to be productive. To deny that excess ends up the excess being put into something destructive like war. And I mean, he says, but if these two terms are to be reconciled, we must cease to ignore one of them. Almost as if, yeah, this kind of like optimism of like, if we do note that there's excess happening, that maybe we don't have to, it doesn't have to be as destructive, but it's like, could it be productive? No. And in a sense, like, would making it not destructive be a productive endeavor? And it is maybe that kind of like where he runs into that impossibility of his project. I don't know. And Joseph, I did appreciate your comment. You were making sense.
Yay! Sometimes I feel like I'm
Yeah.
not.
Well, I had some comments on it, but I forgot now. I need to return to the page.
So the,
Brought up something. Oh, Eric, go ahead.
I'll be quick. The crude analogy I had in my head reading that part, you know, this expenditure has to come out one way or another, whether you direct it rationally or whether you let it happen, right? Again, Nevin might remember potty training a toddler who doesn't want to poop in the potty, right? And so, I mean, honestly, that came to my mind, and I think it works well thinking about Bataille and his notion of expenditure in that context, right? It's going to come out one way or another. And if you do it in a rational way, then you can put it in the toilet and flush it and say goodbye. But if you don't, right, you might shit the bed. So
I like that.
Right. So
And that
going
makes
on.
sense to me. Sorry.
It also makes me think of it's when he's talking about how it's deemed like unsavory to sit on an excess. This is only like somewhat related. I just thought it was funny. It made me think of or how it's undesirable to be sitting on excess. It made me think about how at his peak, Pablo Escobar had so much money that it was sitting in warehouses and like decaying and molding, and I think it burned at one point. I feel like more like culturally outside of what he's talking about, like that can be seen as a good thing to amass so much wealth that it's just like it could be burning. But it also, I mean, that's just more speaking to like Pablo Escobar as a figure. But I maybe think of that as a physical example.
You know, another example that occurred to me is consciousness. You know, Nietzsche makes the point, and I think even, you know, like contemporary, more or less analytic philosophers like David Chalmers make the point that consciousness, self-awareness is completely superfluous. You know, the whole thing about zombies, you know, is that we could be walking around as biological machines doing exactly the same things that we're doing now without having any self-consciousness or self-awareness. That self-consciousness and self-awareness is just useless. And you know, so then the question is, from an evolutionary point of view, how did that happen? Well, I mean, evolution generates useless shit all the time, but consciousness is a pretty complicated pile of useless shit. And so, which causes me personally a great deal of discomfort. And so anyway, you know, consciousness itself maybe is an example.
I think the point has already been talked about. Going back to both what Eric, Joey, and Cole and Nevid have been talking about is when we have this excess, what do we do about it, right? So there's that idea of war. You can make it productive because it's got to be waste. So can you waste it better? And on the top of page 24, he writes, for if we do not have the force to destroy the surplus energy ourselves, it cannot be used. And like an unbroken animal that cannot be trained, it is this energy that destroys us. It is we who pay the price of the inevitable explosion. This is him talking about catastrophic destruction, right? And so through this book and recognizing that expenditure or excess exists, we can begin to think about new ways of wasting, perhaps, and I'm sure the rest of the book will cover it. But like he talked about with war, no practical examples, I believe he said, spring into his mind as to what we should use instead. And I had this naive thought, the US military, right, hundreds of billions, I believe, somewhere in the billions, go to it. And one might say, oh, you know, why don't we just put that money elsewhere? And I don't think that would be an example of excess or waste. Trillions, my fault. Wow. So I'm wondering if we use the American wealth that is given to the US military, what would a proper use of excess even look like, right? Instead of just putting the funds towards something else, where would the waste be in that? It seems productive if you just take that money and give it to education, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's his contradiction. And, you know, I don't know if he talks about it in this book, but he talks a lot about sacrifice. And that comes to mind just in response to that. And I heard, you know, some podcaster talking about, like, he talks about sacrifice almost as that like political action of like doing these sacrifices to try to adjust that how we expend.
You know, this might be too productive an example, I mean, seriously, but you know, what if you just threw a lot of that money at the poor? And so, you know, because there's a lot of people will say, well, one reason you don't want to just give people, the poor, you know, give the poor money is because they're going to misuse that money. Actually, the data suggests that that's not the case, but you know, that they primarily use it on for food and shelter and so on. But you know, I mean, if at least some people think that that's sort of a useless thing, because, well, I mean, so for example, the poor are not productive in a social sense. I mean, they don't, you know, if you throw a lot of money at the poor, they're going to consume part of it and then maybe buy dope and alcohol. I don't know, but they're probably not going to create a whole bunch of, you know, a whole bunch of economic value for the nation. So I don't know, why not just give the poor loads of money? I mean, rather than putting into the military, maybe that would actually be a good, you know, a wasteful expenditure where maybe those people are just going to waste that money. You know, maybe they're just going to waste it on stupid shit. But, you know, the poor wasting a whole lot of money on stupid shit, in my mind, is better than throwing trillions of dollars at the military.
That idea of that the poor will squander all that money is interesting to me, because we live in a consumer economy, right, where you barely meet anyone, I don't think I have, who lives only according to their physiological needs, right? They might have clothes, preferably. They have somewhere to sleep, and all they do is spend their money on food and water, right? They're just efficient. But what I find as a resident assistant who talks to a lot of young college people is that they do spend money on superfluous items, but that's a whole market right there, which others depend on to get their base physiological needs, and then some excess money to spend on streaming services and other amenities. And this idea, if you give the poor money, they're going to squander it. They're going to squander it into other businesses and markets that are, yeah, idiots, right? Into other markets, which will go back, won't it?
Yeah,
So I don't get.
Well,
Okay,
well,
sorry.
so I think that is his question, right? I think maybe that's what he'll get at.
I really want to read more. This is so fascinating to me, right? Like, because like the whole idea of production being some form of identity of humanity really does kind of objectify us into almost a utilitarian perspective of societal interaction, which can breed this objectification and discomfort. And I'm curious to see how he enacts this in something like art and sexuality, because art and sexuality in and of itself can be an excessive, almost non-productive way of human expression. And I'm wondering how he's going to integrate that into the economy, because this is really, really fascinating.
So I think he's going to see sexuality as kind of the example par excellence of this principle, and really the economy is going to be something where it's more mixed. And so I read a little bit of something today that was saying that he thought the success of this volume was a little iffy, but the second and the third volume on eroticism, that was good because it's such a good example. But okay, so the thing about, you know, the poor people and misuse and all these things, you know, I think that's a really good example of the idea of a misuse. You know, that's a great example of that kind of restricted point of view, where it is. One thing I thought was interesting that he talks about these as different perspectives, and I think you can see there that is a perspective that gives that criterion of misuse, that says, you know, something like buying dope or alcohol or whatever, or just even like useless consumer things, that's part of, you know, misuse. But I think what he would say is that's that inevitable expenditure, of course. What the hell else are you gonna like spend it on? There's an excess of money. You know, these people aren't starving. Like, they can eat food. Like, so yeah, they're gonna buy things. Yeah, I think that's where, okay, you've got this idea of like a rational economy, like, oh yeah, there's, you know, these rational economic agents, and they calculate, you know, based off their own needs, and get these things and get resources and use them intelligently if they have enough money already. But then the idea is, okay, but then you have that, but in order to have that as part of its conditions of possibility, you need that kind of consumer society to go along with it, to have this demand for these processes of production anyways. So it's something that, yeah, defeats itself. And I think that's what he's kind of getting at by saying that there's always kind of this hidden, you know, the perverse, you know, flip side, the obverse of these processes, where you have this expenditure aspect, this aspect of just whatever, I don't care, just buy this stupid thing, you know. Yeah, but, and as far as, yeah, just kind of like giving money to poor people and whatnot, so I think to a certain extent, yeah, you can make that like this kind of like rational plan of, you know, we're gonna do this and it's gonna fix. Yeah, he would definitely say like that's no, but I think there is definitely an aspect of where he's saying that kind of pre-capitalist societies, I think that's what kind of what he says, usually had these social kind of processes where they already had a kind of feedback loop of expenditure kind of built into them, where this excess wealth would be something that was expected to be spent in some way that was used for all of society, more so than just simply like private accumulation of wealthy individuals. So it wasn't so much like, you know, now we see it as, you know, everyone's just an individual, you know, and there's kind of like these strange like corporate bodies that are somehow also individuals, or kind of too, they're persons. But you know, it's basically like Jeff Bezos. Like, he's an individual. He's got what, billions and billions of dollars or whatever, you know, and we think of like that, and then we kind of project that back throughout history as if it's always been that way, but it really wasn't. I think what he's saying is that before there was, if you had tons of money, you were expected basically to do things like give to charity, build churches, throw festivals, have basically parties, this kind of stuff. And that's where actually social value came from, something like that. Like, if I can throw this massive festival and, you know, build this monument in my honor, that's more something that is a part, that's what the use function to a certain degree of wealth would be, not this private individual accumulation. So I think there was always this aspect of, you know, you have wealth, you have excess in some degree, but it always is in this process of circulation back into other parts of the economy that also are involved in their own process of expenditure and whatnot. So, but now it's changed, and now we have a hard time kind of understanding that, where we think like, oh my God, we can't give the money to poor people, they'll buy booze. Okay, let's go buy some booze. It is like, what do you think the rich people do with it? Do you think they buy just like bread and water? They squander more than anyone, surely.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Were you gonna say something? Sorry.
I was gonna say that it all came out. Chase put the first half, and Jackson came out with the second half, so I didn't say it.
I was gonna say also it might be a mistake to focus on actual material wealth and money, because I think he's also more focusing on production. As a producer, if you're making more than anyone needs, even if you're not keeping it, I think the body is still is given the necessary urge to expend. So even if we have the higher producers or those owning production, more in charge of production, they still might be able to orient how it's expended, even if it's given to a lower class.
I think you bring up a good point that we've been focusing on wealth in the in the money way. And he, at least Bataille, describes excess energy as wealth. So I'm wondering what examples of expenditure based on vitality or energy would look like, right? And you brought up the point that even if the poor's, right, were given all this money, the structures in place kind of limit how they're going to spend it. You're doomed to be a consumer, right? Go watch some Netflix or Hulu, not both.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely more than just money going on here, especially, yeah, because he definitely, and I think that's a good idea to think of, is he's saying this is a material process. This is, so there's almost a kind of vitalism, it seems like. You know, he's talking about living matter and whatnot. Also, you know, has a resonance with Bergson. But yeah, there's definitely an aspect to it where he's definitely, especially with our, you know, economy in the narrow sense, money and capital is going to be heavily involved in that. You know, it's not every aspect of it, and that, I think that is kind of you know, it's something, whether it's from kind of like a post-structuralist or like a Marxist perspective, it's going to be a kind of fallacy to kind of say that you know, capital is involved in every single aspect of that. when really there's these material processes going on as well. So yeah, I think that's a good idea to think of it as it includes definitely that aspect of money, but there's also these material processes that are very much involved. And I think that's where he's really going to get at, that we've ignored that aspect of it. So yeah, it should be interesting to see exactly though how he relates those. So find out.
One idea while you were speaking, Chase, bringing it back to the US military, I wondered, oh, you know, trillions of dollars get spent on the US military. So I was thinking about it from that money point of view. But maybe another thing to think about is just how many people are in the military. It's not a small population. And so if we wanted to drift or shift from war being a source of expenditure, not in terms of money, but also in bodies, right? And these bodies do actions, do work, and the work they do in the military has in mind this goal of war. And so how can we shift those bodies into maybe more productive ways, perhaps, right?
Maybe again, this is too reductionist, but rather than a vitalism, I kind of, actually Joseph and I were kind of tossing this idea around on Discord. I was thinking of it in terms of, basically E equals MC squared. I'm slightly drunk, sorry, having a hard time talking. So, that any kind of movement of anything in the physical universe can be thought of as a movement of energy. Whether it be, organic matter or not organic matter or human economies or whatever. And so the general economy, I thought he was suggesting, it's probably true, is basically everything, the whole, physical system of the universe, and that's the general economy. Like that, he mentioned geophysics in that passage, I think that Cole read earlier. And then I gave that example of geophysics. You have the sun has all this excess energy that it blasts out across the solar system. A bunch of that hits the earth, and then the earth generates a bunch of geothermal energy, excess energy. And those two together end up producing life on the surface of the planet, which itself generates a whole lot of excess energy. And that produces all sorts of crazy wild organisms. And so, everything is generating all this excess energy all the time. And I thought that, at least in the preface, he was saying that somehow we need to take into consideration the way all these systems are involved in this excess production of energy. Kind of like Cole's point, the economy, not just in sort of narrow economic terms, but in this really broad sense. But I really have no idea how to do that. Or, maybe some of his examples are going to give us hints at that, but I don't really know what that means in practical terms.
Yeah, so I think he's definitely, that idea of energy in the physical sense is a big part of that, is what he's talking about. I think he also wants to kind of expand that principle a little bit by really connecting it with life. As he talks about it as, okay, there's, these dynamic movements of living energy, and that life is something that's kind of part of that movement, and that organisms are something that's kind of like a restriction that's sort of built on top of that, these particulars. So there's going to be something that is a kind of vital force that underlies the particular organism, the fixity of it. But then I think that life process is going to be something that expands beyond just kind of biological in the narrow sense that we think of it, in terms of the strict domain of the sciences that he talks about in the beginning. So, but yeah, that idea of the sun and solar energy, I think, is a crucial part of what he's talking about. That, yeah, the sun is this pure expenditure. It gives, we don't return any energy to it, not that I'm aware of. I don't know, I can imagine some kind of like, like a Tesla, Amazon, like partnership that like decides to go and like return energy to the sun or something. Just totally ridiculous, but like, who knows, could happen. But okay, no, really. So yeah, the sun is this principle of pure expenditure of energy. It comes here, and then that's where it hits the surface and starts to circulate and starts to form all these different things. And once again, Bergson talks about this in Creative Evolution as, you've got solar energy, but then what is the process of life within this? It's a kind of delay of entropy within that. So you've got, kind of a straight entropy, and then organisms work as this way of diverting entropy and energy towards some kind of negative entropy, some kind of higher degree of order, only to then just kind of just crap out and just go back to entropy when it goes along with the movement. But that seems to be a big part of what he's talking about with this process of circulation of on the surface of the globe, especially. So yeah, that's the sun. So I think he'll get to that. I think somewhat later in the book. I'm not sure when exactly, but I guess maybe this next part, hopefully. I think that is a really crucial element.
Yeah, I agree. I think undoubtedly the sun as a symbol of most of what he's talking about is very near to what he's talking about, especially even in like his first work, The Story of the Eye, or I believe his first work, if not it was his first novel. He compares the sun directly to an egg, directly to an eye. Yeah, very, very important in that they're all connected in their expenditure. So I think I would agree that in his view, like the sun is the ultimate expenditure of energy.
I'm going to be the first to say it. I was disappointed that we weren't reading Heidegger, and now I'm really happy we're reading this. So this is pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, I can nerd out about Heidegger all day pretty much, but yeah, I'm really glad we're reading this too.
Yeah, good call, guys. Or everyone.
I didn't think anyone would really, I thought it was just going to be too esoteric, so I wasn't even thinking about it, but then Hunter brought it up and I was just like, oh, hell yeah. So blame Hunter for good things.
Joey mentioned earlier, but after our previous readings like Hegel and Schelling, this is such a breath of fresh air. And I really found this first section, both the preface and the section on, what's it called? The first chapter, basically, very readable. I did not really have to hold up a second, say, I'm going to come back to this, Yeah.
Yeah, we're still reading Hegel in between the lines, Hunter.
I'm kind of curious about the Hegel connection. I think that's more, it seems more like his so I've been kind of skimming through some secondary sources, but also kind of looked through his some of his other essays. The inner experience one seems really interesting, and I know he talks a lot about Hegel in there, but I'm not sure how Hegel would fit in the Accursed share so much, but I don't know.
Well, I see like him working with contradiction in interesting ways. Like that section I read about means and ends, and it's kind of seeming impossible, and about recognizing both sides. I've also sifted through some secondary sources, and it does seem like Hegel's thought is very, present there in some way or another.
Yeah, definitely. I think eventually we'll need to talk about all the Nietzschean aspects as well. He's very much taking after a lot of Nietzsche. I think in particular, the second essay of the genealogy of morality, which is the best section of the genealogy of morality, probably the best Nietzsche. I recommend it in general for understanding almost all these French post-structuralists. He's kind of a sort of a proto post-structuralist, which sounds ridiculous. That sounds like some Hegelian stuff. Yeah. But I think it's, yeah, understanding the role of Nietzsche, in particular that aspect, I think he's really influential in that reception of it. So it should be interesting to see how that kind of coordinates with it in the future.
Yeah, I saw little bits of Nietzsche here and there scattered throughout even just the reading for this time. And I'm hoping, because if I remember right, Hunter has a pretty strong interest in Bataille, and is thinking of doing some writing on Bataille, I think. So I'm curious as to, I hope in future discussions, Hunter will show it, tell us some of his thinking about how the two relate to one another.
I need to get alcohol. I have no alcohol. How am I going to have any kind of expenditure going on here? I feel super sober and it's distressing. Anxiety.
You got to surpass that anxiety. Recognize your problem, number one. This is a self-help book, actually, right? Start wasting better. Anyway, yeah, it is time to go. Thank you, Chase, for the exit ticket.
Yeah, we
Goodbye,
miss
everyone.
it's great having the new faces here, and we certainly missed you, Joey and Jordan. Welcome. Cole, thank you for all your insight. Ripley as well. Appreciate everyone. Thank you so much.
Take care. Friday.
See ya maybe Monday or maybe Friday.